It's day 3 of the Brian Williams fabricated helicopter story. Can he survive? So folks, just as I predicted yesterday, Brian Williams is going to be the subject, and has been the subject, of endless mockery. Twitter is going crazy. The internet is ablaze with people laughing at Brian Williams, mocking him for claiming credit of being at the moon landing, the Revolutionary War, you name it. And I suspect he's going to get more and more of that criticism for quite some time. I'm going to stick with my original prediction, and that is that Brian Williams will not lose his job over this. Now, there are 2 big possible exceptions, but let me tell you why I think Brian Williams is not going to lose his job. And for starters, let me just clear the air. I'm not particularly a Brian Williams fan. I don't really have a strong opinion of him either way. I'm not a fan. I don't dislike him. I don't watch him. He's not a friend of mine. So nothing I'm saying is about sort of standing up to protect a friend or an insider or anything like that. So that's not what my commentary is about. But it's been suggested to me by some of my readers that, well, Brian Williams is going to be safe because the liberal media establishment is going to protect him. Let me tell you, folks, what is going to protect Brian Williams is conservatism. Conservatism in business practices. The desire to make and keep as much money as possible. So here's what's going to save Brian Williams. He's #1 in the ratings. His newscast for years now has been #1, and that means hundreds of millions of dollars for advertising for NBC and its parent company and their investors. Now, if they were to take him off the air, they might slip from #1 to #2 to #3. There is no second in command ready to take over. Brian Williams is still considered a young man by the standards of network news anchors. He's been doing it for 10 years. And Dan Rather was doing it until his 70s. Walter Cronkite, Tom Brokaw all made it to 65 or so. So NBC, you've got to think, is really hoping to get another decade out of Brian Williams. They just signed him to another huge $10 million a year, 5-year contract. So they do not want to lose him because they'd essentially be losing hundreds of millions of dollars. They've invested basically $100 million in salary in him over the years, and another $100 million or so in all the promotion and the billboards and the promos and the bus ads. So they're not going to walk away from that. Now, before you're cynically saying, well, that's just because, the liberal media helped their own, the very same factor is in play for Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh had scandals involving illegal drug use, and yet stations stood by him, advertisers stood by him, because he's #1 in the ratings. And he makes everybody a lot of money. So this really is not a left-right partisan issue. Now, it's also been suggested to me by some readers that this is exactly like the Dan Rather situation, and just like Dan Rather lost his anchor chair when it revealed that he didn't have all of his facts straight regarding documents with George W. Bush and his whole draft deferment issue, that this is the same thing here with Brian Williams. Well, here's the big difference. In the case of Dan Rather, you have a guy that had antagonistic relationships with the Nixon administration. Jesse Helms had long hated Dan Rather and tried to get people to buy CBS and be Dan Rather's boss. So Dan Rather was someone seen by a whole lot of people, certainly all conservatives and Republicans, as anti-Republican and anti-conservative. The story that brought him down was one where he could have taken out and destroyed a Republican conservative president. Contrast that with Brian Williams. Now, I'm sure at some point there's some story Brian Williams has done that has angered or upset conservatives and Republicans. But this particular story of him saying he was on a helicopter that was shot and went down isn't attacking Republicans. It's not attacking the military. In fact, everything he said about the military has been positive. So this particular story is missing the left-right Republican-Democratic dynamic that was a part of what brought Dan Rather down. So that's another reason why I do not think that Brian Williams is going to lose his career over that. There's simply too much money, too much infrastructure in place dependent on Brian Williams. And there are not enough people who really hate Brian Williams. The other factor I'm seeing is there's a certain faction in our current political wars where one side says anybody who isn't for us all the time is against us and is evil and is a monster. So I think what's happening to Brian Williams in part is the sense that people who don't like the so-called mainstream media are trying to use him as a surrogate. If you don't like the mainstream media, here's our chance to get a scalp on the wall. And it's not that they really have anything against Brian Williams. It's also been suggested to me by some of you readers and viewers that, again, Brian Williams is going to get support from the White House and all sorts of liberal Democrats because he's on their team. Well, let me tell you, I'm right here in the New York City area, and I've worked in the New York City area and the Washington, D.C. area for more than 20 years. And I can tell you, I don't know of a single liberal or Democratic activist who thinks Brian Williams is in any way on their team or is liberal in any way. Now, they typically don't hate him. They just think of him as sort of a bland, boring, straight shooter. Now, you're more than happy to disagree with that, but the idea that they're all going to rally around him is just, for ideological reasons, is just not happening. So, again, my prediction to clarify, I think Brian Williams is going to save his job. There's two areas that could destroy him. Number one, if the ratings go down because so many people lose faith in him and his credibility is destroyed, if his ratings go down, then the advertising revenues go down. Well, then, yeah, he's going to be fired like that. So he's certainly not immune to marketplace pressures. The second thing that could kill him, or his career, is if more and more stories like this come out. If all of a sudden everything he said at Katrina was wrong and everything he said in this story, if pieces of actual news stories that he's reported are now picked apart and there's conclusive evidence that his facts were wrong, well, that could destroy him. He can't take more hits on a similar issue. But if it's contained to this issue, I think it's neutralized and it goes away. And people who don't like Brian Williams will be talking about this for the next 40 years, but there's a good chance Brian Williams will be on the air as the anchor for the next 10 years. Again, I'm giving myself two caveats. Otherwise, I think his career is safe. What do you think? Post your comments here.